Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Sonali Rai from the RNIB. That's the Royal National Institute of Blind People. I work as the broadcast manager, and we work on audio description, broadcast, and video games now. I'm here to talk about the accessible gaming research of 2022. It's a collaborative study led by the RNIB in partnership with Murray House School of Education, University of Edinburgh, and I2 Media Research, Goldsmiths, University of London.
Hi, I'm Johnny Freeman. I'm Professor of Psychology at Goldsmiths, University of London. I'm also Academic Lead for Knowledge Exchange at Goldsmiths. And today I'm wearing my I2 Media Research hat. I'm Managing Director of I2 Media, a spin-off from Goldsmiths, University of London, with over 25 years experience on accessibility and usability of digital products, platforms, and services. And today I'm going to be talking about the user research, both qualitative and quantitative, done as part of this project.
Hi, I'm John Payden, and I'm a technology officer working at RNIB in the media and culture team under Sonali.
So I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with the RNIB, so let me start with a brief introduction of what we do. We're the Royal National Institute of Blind People, one of UK's leading sight loss charities and the largest community of blind and partially sighted people. We see ourselves as a catalyst for change, so inspiring people with sight loss to transform their own experience, their community, and ultimately society. Our focus is on giving them the help, support, and tools they need to realize their aspirations. So it's about empowering people. And like any other national charity, we work across a number of different areas, including access to education, reading services, employment, finance, transport, and we have some of the leading experts working on specialist formats like Braille and Tactile. And in this vast RNIB universe, I've got a small team that works on access to entertainment, so media and culture services. We cover broadcast, film, video on demand, museums, and now video games. We've got different touch points, so we work on advocacy, policy, collaborate with the industry on user experience, collaborate on research studies to understand benefits of next generation of access services. We're very much a user-led team, a user feedback-led team. So which means the more feedback we get in a specific service, the more likely it is that we'll start looking into the accessibility of that service and how accessible it is for blind and partially sighted people. And there has been tremendous feedback on video games, and that's one of the reasons why we've started this project. About this, the research project, the methodology, it's a multi-method approach. We started with a user research. The first part was quantitative research, a large-scale survey done with over 500 respondents. This was followed up by qualitative research, which was done by our user experience team at RNIB. And simultaneous to this was the industry consultation. Now, the purpose of the user study was to identify and establish the barriers that people with different levels of sight loss, mild, moderate, and severe, experience in trying to play video games on different platforms. The industry consultation was to understand the industry perspectives on the opportunities and challenges they consider in developing games with access features for different platforms and devices. I'll hand you over to Professor Freeman now to take you through the user research, and then John Payden will summarize the results of the industry survey. And then I'll wrap up with the presentation with a few recommendations that have emerged from the study. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Sonali. So we've mentioned already the user research that Sonali's just introduced. And there were four main research questions that we tackled with the user research, and they're listed on the screen now, but I'll read them out for accessibility. The first is, what are the key barriers to engaging with video games for people with and without vision impairment? The next question was, could more accessible games with features that allowed independent play change gaming habits for blind and partially sighted people? The next question is, what factors influence the perceptions of the accessibility of different video games? And finally, what are the preferred accessibility features that people with vision impairment would appreciate and want to see more of in video games? In terms of the research method, there were two major elements to the user research. So there was quantitative research and qualitative research. The quantitative research was conducted by a 60-question gaming survey developed by i2 Media in partnership with RNIB and University of Edinburgh, which we then put online onto a survey platform, and it was then distributed online. We got responses from more than 500 respondents, which was brilliant. Of those, 464 were full, complete and clean data sets usable for our analyses. The sample spanned a very wide age range of participants, including those under 18 years of age, all the way through to those age 65 years and above. And it included gamers, ex-gamers, people who'd never gamed before in the UK and internationally. In terms of the qualitative research, I'm going to present the results of both elements combined, but the qualitative research conducted interviews of 21 gamers with different types and levels of vision impairment to understand barriers to playing games in greater detail and to understand their preferences in more detail. So it's really to dig deeper on the findings we got from the quantitative research. So what were the main results? Well, may not surprise you to hear that people with sight loss are motivated to play games for exactly the same reasons as those without sight loss. Though really interestingly, the quant research showed that they were more motivated by the challenge. And that in itself may indicate just how challenging accessibility of gaming is for people with sight impairment. People with sight loss recognise that improvements to the accessibility of gaming would improve their experience and increase their motivation to play. And taken together, those two results really strongly demonstrate an appetite to play games that is not sufficiently served currently for people with sight loss. We heard the word, the challenge, being an attraction for blind and partially sighted people who play games. And one of the things we observed from the qualitative research and got a lot of rich data on were the coping strategies that gamers with sight loss reported using. They reported that they had to be heavily reliant on their own ad hoc coping strategies, and they included things like playing with sighted guidance, memorizing specific button sequences and menu layouts, or by using Be My Eyes or Seeing AI to read what's on screen. And there's a quote that we've found from our qualitative research, which I'll just read out now, because it really makes the point. I tried to play a character-based game, thought it would be accessible. I created a character, and then there was a lot of graphic text on the screen. I needed a workaround, so I used the Seeing AI app on my iPhone to read the text. This worked well until I realized I had to do magic spells following a line on the screen. I FaceTimed a sighted friend, and she told me where to put my finger, and I managed to get to do the spell. However, after a few times I abandoned it, so as not to ask my friend all the time. Now, that really clearly illustrates that without help from either screen reading at the AI, Seeing AI app, or their friend, they wouldn't have been able to play the game. And in the end, they gave up playing that game because they didn't want to be a burden on their friend. So coping strategies are used, but they are not entirely sufficient, and we have to consider accessibility better in games than we do currently. Some more main results. So more than 7 in 10 of our participants with sight loss reported their sight limited their ability to play games. And amongst the ex-gamers in our survey, that inaccessibility was cited as the main reason for stopping playing games. The game genres most difficult to play for people with sight loss included shooting games, racing games, sports games, and MMOs, massively multiplayer online games. The most popular gaming platforms reported by our sample were PC, followed by iOS, and then web browsers. Interestingly, audio games, for example on Alexa, were much more popular among people with sight loss than sighted gamers. And again, these are all evidence points that demonstrate strong demand and need for accessible gaming for people with sight loss. In terms of the accessibility solutions that people with sight loss were most interested in, there are 3 major groupings: audio, haptic, and visual. And with regard to audio, the number 1 came out as compatibility with screen readers. Also really valued was standard audio description, personalized description tracks, and then spatial audio and audio triggers. In terms of haptic cues, they support immersion for everybody. So in terms of inclusive design, the more haptic feedback and interaction you can have with a game, the better it will be for everybody. blind and partially sighted users and gamers actually dependent on those haptic cues in many instances for feedback, and they would value them more. And obviously the final one were the visual adaptations, so changing font size, color, and contrast. So the conclusions from the user research are really straightforward. The needs and preferences of people with sight loss for improved accessibility of video games is clear. We need to address these opportunities because that will support more engagement by people with sight loss with games. Gamers with sight loss face a number of barriers to video games based on their accessibility, and in many instances, that's been enough to stop them from playing games. People with sight loss are just as motivated to play games and have experience of multiple platforms, and their motivation has been strong enough that they've developed their own strategies to overcome the accessibility challenges that gaming currently sets for them. Strong express need was observed for better audio-based features, compatibility with screen readers and audio-based integrated narrative descriptions. And several features were valued both by people with and without sight loss. So for example, the option of changing your audio settings and adapting your sound mix. And this highlights that although any adaptation or innovations in game accessibility will obviously benefit blind and partially sighted gamers, the market for those adaptations is even bigger than the market that is blind and partially sighted. And finally, really important to note that our participants told us that games companies and platforms that don't take account of accessibility actually suffer in terms of how they're perceived by both our sighted and our blind and partially sighted participants. So industry really does have to address accessibility better to be perceived well and as a caring provider of entertainment for blind and partially sighted people, just as it is for the rest of the population. I'm now going to hand over to John, who will unmute himself to talk us through the industry research.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, so in terms of the industry research, we had 4 key research topics. How well do you understand the needs of gamers with partial sight loss? How well do you understand the needs of gamers with severe sight loss? What prevents the industry from designing games that are accessible for gamers with vision impairments? And what would encourage you to consider making your games accessible for gamers with vision impairments? We had a 48-question survey. We had 82 developers respond, which was brilliant. Unfortunately, we only had 2 platforms and 5 gaming engines and middleware providers respond. So although we've got that data in the report, we'll be focusing on the developers today. The main results that we found, there was no indication that the size of a studio had any impact on how likely a studio was to consider making the game accessible for gamers who are blind or partially sighted. We did find that developers are far more likely to incorporate access features to meet the needs of gamers with partial sight loss rather than those with severe sight loss and no sight at all. And most developers reported a firm understanding of the needs of gamers with partial sight loss, also agreed that they will always aim to make their games accessible for that group. This wasn't the same for developers who reported a firm understanding of the needs of gamers with severe sight loss or no sight at all. They didn't commit to always aim to make their games accessible for gamers with severe sight loss. So in terms of the barriers, we asked which factors might prevent you or have prevented you from incorporating changes that improve the accessibility of your game for people with vision impairments. 3 factors got 50% or more. The largest was that underlying game engines did not support accessibility features. And that was a bit of a recurring theme. We had a lot of developers say that would make a big difference in whether they can make a game accessible or not. The next largest at 54%, it would be too costly to re-engineer existing games, which is something that we've seen time and time again. Retrofitting doesn't work, and even if it can work, it's more expensive than building accessibility in from the start. And half respondents said that incorporating accessibility was too complicated. And again, there's a bit of a theme there of the knowledge around how to make things accessible. We we had 34%, so less than 4 game engines, but 34% said that platforms that support platforms not supporting accessibility features was an issue. And then we had 26% say it would compromise creative vision, and 20% say it would adversely affect the quality of the gameplay. It's good to see that only 12% reckoned that the lack of legal requirements was any factor in the decision to make something accessible or not. So we had a few comments from developers around the barriers. Accessibility is considered early in the planning and design, pre-production phase, but concrete implementations tend to happen later during production. Its development order is often lower priority than many other aspects. And videos are how people use their devices day to day with immersive over-the-shoulder shots, not just flashy features. It takes seeing it to get its importance for developers. And somebody else said that we're lacking government governance at the moment in most countries. So we said before that companies didn't know how to make things accessible. So we were also asking about the knowledge gaps. And again, there was 3 that were over 50%. So 64% said they weren't sure of the user needs of specific groups, like people with sight loss or hearing loss. 60% said they weren't sure how to prioritize against other game features. And 51% said they weren't sure how to prioritize which groups to consider. Now, slightly less, we had 45% didn't know how to find disabled people to involve and test with. 43% said they're aware of the user requirements, but they weren't sure how to incorporate them into the game design. And the 2 lowest were around kind of economic viability. 32% not sure on the return on investment, and 23% not sure of the market size. Now, they were the lowest ones, suggesting that companies didn't see the economic factors to be much of a decision maker at all. But actually, 16 out of 32 of the comments did reference economic factors in some way. So 16 out of 32 comments were linked to these economic considerations, but not all were. Somebody said, personally, it's a matter of knowledge, technical ability, and time and energy that's lacking, instead of any financial or philosophical encouragement. And seeing other indie developers being able to implement more extensive accessibility features on their games. Without it, it looks like a very risky thing to do. So we found there are 4 influencing factors in the level of accessibility the games developers are building in. 1 was readiness. So that's having the knowledge and the tools available to make something accessible. 1 was human factors. So that's seeing how accessibility impacts the people that it helps. We did see that there was some economic and policy factors that influenced it, and reputational impact. So a lot of reputation, either with gamers or within the industry. 2 of those, the readiness, so being able to make it accessible, and the human factors seemed slightly more important to the industry than the other 2. So on to the conclusions. So the current state of play, there was no indication that the size of the studio had any impact on how likely they were to consider making the game accessible to gamers with sight loss. But we did find there were greater challenges for making games accessible for people with severe sight loss or no sight at all than for people with partial sight loss. And that was echoed in the features that developers said they'd managed to already build into their games. There was a lot more things like customizable subtitles, high contrast font size, than there was integration with screen readers. Challenges and way forwards. So key barriers cited by developers for the inclusion of access features were a lack of game engine support for accessibility features. Accessibility solutions might adversely affect gameplay or creativity. And again, coming back to complexity, it's the 3rd one. And over 70% of developers would like to see sharing of knowledge and technology within the industry, and better resources on accessibility good practice. So obviously playing into that complexity issue. And engagement. So another major theme. More user engagement will help the industry understand how access features such as screen readers, magnification, audio description, audio triggers, and cues are used with people with visual impairments. And developers in general expressed a very high level of interest in interacting with end users to understand their requirements, experiences, and user journeys. But as of now, the level of engagement depended on the size of the organization, with larger studios having far more opportunities to make those links. And over to you, Sonali.
Thanks, Joan. So I will only share the top 3 recommendations that have emerged from the study today. This is an extensive piece of work, so if anyone would like to explore the findings in detail, please just get in touch. So the first recommendation is about finding the right games to play with the right access features. So the recommendation is, it is essential that blind and partially sighted gamers are better supported in finding accessible games. Accessibility feature tags at the point of sale, which have already been introduced by Microsoft, are a good way to do this, and a widespread adoption of this feature is highly recommended. I think it's quite important to note here that for many people, losing sight is not a one-off event. People lose sight gradually and experience a number of deteriorations in what they can see. This means people may need support to learn and then relearn how to adapt as their sight deteriorates. This means we need to make it easy for people to find games with different access features, which are easy to turn on and off, make the experience more intuitive and consistent. The second recommendation is there is a need for better industry-wide knowledge sharing and collaboration to disseminate and embed best practice in addressing accessibility from the earlier stages of a game's development process. I think this is something that's come out quite strongly from the industry consultation. The industry is aware that it needs to be done at the blueprint stage. You need to bring your consultants in, your users in, to start testing the concepts. There are barriers, however, but those barriers can be addressed. And I think there's a key role here for organizations representing blind and partially sighted people, like the RNIB in the UK and others around the world, and particularly when it comes to engaging blind and partially sighted gamers with different levels and types of sight loss. The third recommendation that I'll share today is about user requirements. So requirements that allow gamers with vision impairments to play independently should be addressed as a priority. Playing independently is the key word here. So these include full integration with screen readers, a customizable UI, customizable user interface, and audio description, or an alternative in the form of integrated narrative descriptions, adaptable sound mixes, and audio settings. Now, these solutions must be embedded consistently and interoperable through the tech stack. Now, in addition to these, there were a few research recommendations for further research. And for that, I'll hand you back to Jonathan.
Thanks, Sonali. So yes, 3 recommendations for further research that we pulled out of the research. The first is that we need to do more research to measure the usage and popularity of accessibility features in games of different genres in real world settings. So we use the survey, but we'd love to be able to collect real data from the platforms to understand how the accessibility features are being used. The second is we need to understand better the economic impact of including more accessibility features. So you heard John talk about economic considerations featuring in 16 of the 32 industry interviews, industry responses. And we really need solid data to assess the market size of blind and partially sighted gamers and their willingness to pay for different games, and therefore the potential return on investment. This exercise really would help to improve industry confidence in including accessibility features in more games as standard. And the third is kind of a techie one, so John probably better placed than me to talk about it, but we really need to understand the different middleware considerations and interdependencies of accessibility within the tech stack. And you'll see that we've actually put a tick there because it's great to see that this is actually already underway in some of the case studies that the industry research has looked at. Over to you, Sonali.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the research session. So thank you very much for your time. I'd like to thank Ian Hamilton and the rest of the GA conference organizers for inviting us to speak at this conference. It is a privilege to join such a fantastic lineup of speakers. I'm always impressed with GAConf. I think this is my probably the third conference. I hope this presentation was useful, helpful, there's some useful data there. Do email us should you wish to explore the results in more detail. Our email address is gaming@rnib.org.uk. And thanks again for your time and enjoy the rest of your conference.
Bye-bye.
Bye.